Good afternoon and welcome to the OHA webinar with Liz Strong called Freelancing in Oral History. My name is Chris McCusker. I am the co-executive director of the Oral History Association. And on behalf of my colleague, Louis Kiriakoutis, the other co-executive director, and our awesome program associate, Faith Bagley, welcome to this webinar. Let me first say thank you to Liz for agreeing to do this. We are all going to learn some really great information on how to freelance in oral history. Remember that these webinars are always free for OHA members, and we should have another one coming up in late March brought to you by our diversity committee. In the meantime, a live transcription of this webinar is available through Otter AI. You can access the transcription by clicking the link in the chat box, which will open in a new browser, or by clicking to turn on closed captions in Zoom. If you have any problems, of course, accessing the transcription during the webinar, please ask for help in the chat box, and we will try to help with any issues. And without further ado, go to it, Liz.
I'm now unmuted. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz. I'm really looking forward to this webinar today. And I see as some of you are joining in, you're taking a moment to share a little bit about where you're calling from and how long you've been freelancing. This is really helpful for me as I go through, just to make sure that what I'm sharing is relevant for your interests. As we go, I will ask you guys yes or no questions from time to time. You can just write your responses in the chat. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to write those in the chat as well. I'll pause about halfway through to read through some of the questions that have come up. I'll also pause at the end, and we'll have a little more time to read through questions that you guys have as we go. So first, a little bit about me. I started freelancing in 2010. I stopped freelancing in 2019. I got a full-time job at Columbia University, but I still care very much about it. I'm part of the OHA task force for independent practitioners. I try to make myself available for mentorship if people have questions about getting started. And of course, I've started doing workshops like this. I do want to underscore that what I'm covering today should not be considered legal advice or professional business advice. It is all entirely based on information that I have gathered myself from experience and from asking people. So it really is just introductory how to think about resources that are available, how to find resources, and how to advocate for yourself. We'll cover some basics in the first half. And then in the second half, we'll go over tips specifically for budgeting for projects and negotiating proposals. So to start off, I want to say a little bit about what freelancing is. It's very different from employment, where the employer controls what will be done and how it will be done. There's usually a fixed schedule and hours, fixed location, and the employer will probably provide all or most of the materials necessary for the job. When you're freelance, you're working on a contract. You are a professional providing services that are available to the general public. So your clients can dictate what work will be done, but not how it will be done. You provide deliverables by the deadline specified, but when, where, and how the work is done is entirely up to you. You use your own materials, you can hire subcontractors, and you pay for the supplies that you need out of the fee that you charge your client. So the first thing I wanted to ask, and again, this is a yes or no question. If you'd like to answer, you can just type it right in the chat. Has anyone been in a situation where they worked as if they were an employee, but they were paid as a contractor? Charlie says no, and I'm glad to hear it. There are some options in situations like this. Unfortunately, it's fairly common. I personally have experienced it. Several other freelancers I've worked with have experienced it. So the most important thing in a situation like this, where you are being told how to conduct your work, even though you have a contract rather than an hourly rate or a salary as an employee, you can make sure, first of all, that you're going to be credited for your work by name. You can reserve the right to share your work and work products for promoting your services to others. And probably one of the biggest pieces is to try to protect yourself from liability, if at all possible. Usually employees of an organization are covered by their insurance. Everything they do is considered to be the intellectual property and the responsibility of the employer. When you're a contractor, you don't necessarily have those protections. So if you are operating as an LLC, if you have your own insurance, that's always great. If you don't have either of those things, it may make sense to ask for a liability clause in your contract where the client will indemnify you from harm. And that's something we'll touch on in a little more detail later. In either case, you can try to negotiate a higher pay rate to cover your additional risk and, of course, the additional cost of having insurance and things like that. This will come up again later, but we're already starting to see some of the reasons why rates for a contractor may need to be a little bit higher than the rates of an hourly employee or of a salaried employee. I see a few more responses coming in. One person says yes, and one person says sort of, they're on a hybrid model. So hopefully in most cases, the division will be clear, but a lot of times there will be some ambiguity between being an employee and being a freelancer. And so it's very helpful to understand the differences in your own mind so it helps you negotiate the terms of your work. So volunteering and interning. You can only volunteer for nonprofits. For-profit organizations should not be having any unpaid labor. There are often opportunities for unpaid internships, but those are closely regulated. It has to be similar to training in an educational environment. The experiences of the internship need to be for the benefit of the intern. The intern should not displace any potentially paid employees. And the intern should work under close supervision. At the end of the internship, it is understood by both parties that they are not entitled to a job. So unfortunately, again, it's not uncommon for unpaid internships to stretch these regulations. So I just wanted to make it clear in the context of this webinar that there are rules, and you should make sure that when you're working for no pay, as also sometimes happens, that you understand what your relationship is to the person that you're working with, and there are some bounds on what's appropriate. So another question for you guys at this point is whether any of you have experience working for free, maybe not necessarily as a volunteer for an organization or even in an internship setting, but perhaps for a local community or things like that. I just got an emphatic yes. There may be some very good reasons to work for free. This can be expanding your portfolio, supporting a cause or a community that you care about. There is a personal cost to doing this work, but it's also important to consider the collective cost of working for free. The value of oral history labor overall is depressed if there are many opportunities to have people volunteer in an oral history context, if that makes sense. So what can you ask for when you're working for free? One is to have a clearly defined and limited scope of the project and a limited period of time for which you are willing to work for free. If there is a work product that you need to showcase in your portfolio that you're able to do, or if there's something particular about your craft that you want to gain more experience in, you can use volunteering as a time to practice that or to create that work product, to expand your portfolio and to expand your skill set so that it's easier to pitch projects for paid labor later on down the line. So see if this opportunity where you're working for free is also a good chance to get some experience that you need. Of course, make sure that you are credited for your work and that you retain the right to use the work that you've created for free to promote your services to other clients and in paid contexts. And in some cases, retaining intellectual property to your work or the rights to use it in other spaces, such as publications or presentations that may be a benefit to you in exchange for the benefit you just provided to this organization or this community. Another thing you can do sometimes if you're working for a 501c3 is to calculate what the value of your labor would have been if they were compensating you monetarily and log it as a donation to the organization. They may be able to give you a receipt that you can write off on your taxes. I'm just leaving this on the screen for a moment because this is something we covered a moment ago. So when you're working freelance, it can be kind of a vulnerable position to be in. Freelancers do have rights, but advocating for them can be tricky. So for example, in New York City, where I've been working for most of my career, there is a law on the books that protects freelancers' rights. And for the most part, depending on the region you're in, there may be some laws that protect you. But this is just an example of what I have going for me in New York City. So freelancers must have contracts for a project that is valued $8,000 or more. And the contract at minimum has to have the name and mailing address of both parties, the freelancer and their employer, an itemized list of services and the value of those services, and the date that the payment will be due. And if there has been no agreed upon pay scale or deadline for payment, then by default, the law says it has to be 30 days after the completion of services. This law is also very helpful because it stipulates freedom from harassment, which is something that most employees have across the nation, but contractors, while of course they have the right to leave a job if they're being harassed, it's very difficult to take someone to court and get that kind of legal protection. And that's why this aspect of the New York City law is so important. So there's a lot of value to making sure that anytime you take on a project, even if it's unpaid, to have a contract or a letter of agreement. It can support you in the event that you need to go to court, although the odds of us going to court with anyone we work for are very, very low, usually because the costs of going to court are very, very high. Mostly what this does is ensures that both parties know exactly what they're doing before they begin, that they agree to the terms of the project, and create a paper trail that can be referenced along the way. So as expectations change or as deliverables need to change throughout the project, just make amendments to your agreement and then sign those amendments. Invoices are another important part of the paper trail, saying that you did what you said you would do at the time that it was due and that was accepted. It also helps communicate about scope creep, which a lot of us have experienced in freelancing. If you're asked to do something that isn't in the contract or agreement that you wrote, offer to add it into the contract and then quote what the additional cost of that service would be. Intellectual property is a really key part of any agreement. So here are two sort of ballpark categories of how intellectual property works. There's work for hire, where all the intellectual property and work products are the property of the client. Usually if you're an employee, this goes without saying. A lot of contracts that you do for clients may also be completely work for hire. There's also licensing, which is where you can provide licensing terms for a client's use of the intellectual property and work products. So this could be that the client is allowed to use the work product for a bounded period of time or for a bounded purpose. There are some really useful elements to put in your contract or agreement. The name of both parties, a description of the project, which can be very brief, the term of work or the timetable, spelling out certain benchmarks for the work, responsibilities of each party. Sometimes the client will need to deliver things to you in order for you to do the work, and so they'll have responsibilities in addition to your responsibility to do the project. The payment schedule. This could be calculated, say, on a monthly rate. It could be tied to time, could be tied to hours that you work. But many times it's tied to products or percent of work done along the way. There are many different ways to arrange a pay schedule. There's rights and intellectual property, which need to be laid out in detail. Then there's the liability clause, which I mentioned earlier. There's standard language available for this in many different sources that you can find. But essentially what it says is that in the event that, outside gross negligence on your part as the contractor, if a third party wanted to enter litigation about your oral history, commonly for issues of defamation or something like that, that your client would protect you in situations like that and say, no, they signed over all their intellectual property. They're no longer a co-author of the oral history. So all disputes are with us and with the narrator, but not with the interviewer or with the project manager of the oral history project. Confidentiality is also really important in an oral history space because sometimes there's a lot of work between the point of initiating the process and having an actual interview, documentary, book, whatever we're making that's available for the public. And during that time, the conversations that we're having with our narrators, the people we're interviewing, or with our client, people who hired us, are sensitive. And so it's good to have in writing that there's an expectation that they can trust us not to share or reveal any of this information willingly. It's also really useful to have some kind of plan for what happens if you need to terminate the project before it is complete. It may be possible to peg this to a percent of work, or just generally have a sense of what you will do and how you will bring things amicably to a close. The last piece, which is really essential, is to talk about what is the jurisdiction under which this agreement has been signed. So for example, it would behoove me to make sure that the jurisdiction for my agreements are New York City, because those are the laws that protect me the most. If I have a client in another state, then there may be some negotiation between whether they would like it to be the jurisdiction of where they work. And then of course, there's the line that says we both agree to this and it's time to start the project. So for resources on these, personally, I've found that the NOLO publications are really helpful. They are just a basic legal publisher, and they have things for hiring contractors, for subcontracting, and also for yourself being a contractor. If anyone else has favorite resources that they've relied on when it comes to understanding intellectual property or drafting letters of agreement, I highly recommend you throw those in the chat so that others can benefit from them as well. All right, now I'm going to take a quick break. If you guys have questions at this point, please go ahead and write them in the chat. I do see that some came through the Q&A feature, so I'll be looking there as well. So one question that came through is, how do you compute a fee schedule, hourly rates, etc.? That's something we're going to go over in a little bit in the second half. So someone else asked that I put this in the chat, so I'm just typing in NOLO. And again, they have a whole series of legal related publications. I found some of those really helpful. I've also found that you can look to resources outside your field. So early on, I actually got a lot of support through people who were members of the Graphic Artists Guild, for example, because they have a very clear understanding of intellectual property, timetables, work agreements, things like that. And some of that is actually very applicable to oral history as well. Another thing I'm going to write in the chat is a book called Oral History and the Law by John Neuenschwander. May or may not have spelled his last name correctly. But what that focuses on mostly is the intellectual property of oral history interviews themselves. A lot of times these are agreements between organizations and the narrators, the people being interviewed, but that information is also really useful to us as oral historians who are working on a freelance basis. We may be project managers working with narrators and brokering those agreements between the narrators and the organizations, or we may ourselves be interviewers who would have our own co-authorship rights. And so those agreements kind of help us understand the flow of rights that way. Oh, I apologize. What I was writing in the chat was just going to panelists. I'll retype it. The first was NOLO, which I just wrote in. And the second was Oral History and the Law by John Neuenschwander. All right, I'm just scrolling through real quick to see if there are any other questions that I missed from the first half. Oh, that's a good question about whether or not the government counts as a nonprofit in terms of volunteering and interning. I'm afraid I don't know for sure. I think that it does, but probably the best way to have questions like that answered would be through the IRS resources. That's where I found those resources on interning. Someone asked where you get insurance from. I never personally was insured, so I have no recommendations on that. But there are ways of getting liability insurance, insuring your equipment, things like that. And then, of course, if you want to incorporate yourself as a limited liability corporation, that's another way of protecting yourself. We're not going to go over that much in this workshop, namely because I did neither of these things during my freelance career, and so I don't have a lot of direct experience on it. And also because I am not a tax consultant. All right, well, if there's no more questions at this time, I'm going to dive into the second half of our workshop today, and then we'll, of course, have more time for questions at the end. So this is a question that gets asked often, not just at workshops, but of people in your network. When you meet someone who's been freelancing for quite some time, this is one of the first things people usually ask. And there's no single answer to it. Each of us will probably charge something very different. So what I'll introduce you guys today is just some basics for how to start thinking about what your rates should be and in what context. Oral history projects and freelancers are really diverse. So there's no standard rate, and each freelancer and each project is going to have different prices. And that's because we all have different skill sets. We have different levels of experience. Our clients are in different contexts, and also because there are so many different kinds of deliverables that can come out of oral history work. So there really is no standard rate. So start by understanding how much it will cost you to do the work. The cost of subcontractors and materials and other expenses are usually fairly simple to figure out. The cost of your own time is really what's trickiest. It needs to be enough to compensate your labor and to sustain your business. What you bill clients is revenue, remember, and it is not actually to be considered your paycheck. Think about what you need to make each year in order to cover the cost of your business expenses, your equipment, your bills, your professional development, and things like that, as well as your own salary. Once you have a sense of that total, you can divide it by the number of hours you expect to bill clients. So the best way to know what that will be is to look at what you did in the previous year. Now, if you're just getting started, kind of a ballpark to work with is say that 40% of your time might be billable, or maybe 800 hours if you're planning to work full-time in a year. If the rate you need when you figure that out or do that math for yourself, if the rate you need isn't possible, either because you don't have enough billable hours each year to cover that annual amount, because your target client base wouldn't be able to afford that amount, or because you yourself don't yet have the experience or the portfolio to be competitive at that rate, then you may need to find other sources of income to support yourself and leave room in your schedule and the timetable that you set up for your clients to do that extra work. One way to double check if the rate that you hope to charge is attainable is to investigate the salaries of comparable work in your area. So a salaried position at an arts and culture institution, for example, maybe about half to a third as much as a freelancer needs to charge in a year. What private clients are willing to pay is more difficult to double check. Try to seek advice from more experienced freelancers in your region or in your field. They don't necessarily need to be oral historians, as I cited later. Sometimes you can get this kind of advice from videographers or other people who work on a similar project basis. There are other fees to consider when you're deciding on how much to charge as well. So for example, you may want to consider late payment fees. If you're working with a new client who you've never worked with before, if they're not a professional client, like say if they're just an individual working on a family history, it may be worth writing in some late payment fees just to cover yourself and to make it clear that these things need to be timely. The first time someone is late on a payment, it's customary to waive that extra fee, but if it happens regularly, it can really help. Another type of fee to consider is a retainer. And again, this is really only useful if you're working with private clients who are engaging with the project in their spare time. So this would be sort of family history projects. And that can be because, you know, they may contract your services, they may get started, and then months may go by before they're willing to continue working with you. And then, you know, out of the blue, they'll contact you again. So in order for you to reserve space in your life to be on call for when they're ready to make progress, it really helps to have a retainer. Remember that oral history is very scalable. Figure out what the client's budget is and pitch a project that will fit. There's going to be a number of interviews that you can expand or shrink. You can offer full transcripts of the interviews, or you could offer simply metadata of the audio recordings or the video recordings, or maybe just an index. You can offer unedited media of the audio or video, or you can offer something that's more produced, like a documentary style with lots of editing. So all of these things can expand or shrink to fit. So the most important thing as you negotiate a contract is to make sure that you never show the client exactly how you calculated your rate, if that makes sense, because there's the base rate of what your expenses is, and then there's the rate on top of that of what you need to pay. So obviously you can say there's a rate per deliverable, there's a rate per service, there's a rate per time, but all of those little details of how you actually came up with how that rate was, that needs to be proprietary, that needs to be kept private. If they want to make cuts to your proposal, you can ask them about their priorities, edit the proposal yourself. But do not share the rates of your subcontractors. Do not share your markup or how you calculate your own pay. And do not share how much you charged a previous client. These are all things that help you communicate clearly with your clients, but it also helps you protect the value of your labor in the long run. If something comes up where a product or a project needs to be done on a very quick timetable, it may be necessary to add an additional % markup or a service fee, and be transparent about that. This is going to ensure that you'll be able to pause work that you have going for other clients, or to compensate other expenses of prioritizing their work, like days off from your day job or pay for childcare in order to get more space in your day. So again, in order to prioritize their work and make sure that it comes first on a tight timetable, there may be an extra fee for that as well. Just another yes or no question for you guys. Have any of you had the experience of negotiating the cost of proposal that went well or possibly didn't go well? Overall, negotiating can be very tricky. The most important thing is just to be clear and consistent. Once you have pitched a rate to somebody, you can always adjust the deliverables and the scope of the project, but you're not able to adjust the rate itself. It's also totally fine to have a rate for one project or one type of client that doesn't match the rate you're charging another type of client. It's very important that it be proportionate to the kind of work that you're doing or to the sort of job that you have, but it doesn't have to be consistent. When in negotiating, if this is a project that you really, really want and they're just not able to meet your proposed budget, you can't change the rate, but you can consider whether or not part of the work could be an in-kind donation. There are ways to communicate about reducing the budget if you need to slide it into a very small space. And just about everything in a contract or proposal should be negotiable and can be reworked as you go, of course, as long as you keep a clear paper trail. And clients should feel welcome to ask questions about your proposal or agreement and to work with you on changes if needed. So I'm seeing some really helpful comments here. One from Karen saying, I'm working on a memoir, coaching a client. I pitched 2 options for the retainer, a short-term and a longer, and she took the short-term but left the door open for more. And then someone asked a very good question, which is, what is the walkaway point? So I'm going to turn that question back to you guys. Have anyone who's on the webinar today, yes or no, had a moment where they had to walk away from a project after it began? Or even at the negotiation phase? This is rare, but it does happen sometimes. Some of the cases may be if it's costing you money to do the work or preventing you from taking on other interesting work. Sometimes if you find you can't condone the ethical practices of your client. Remember that oral history has some pretty rigorous ethical guidelines. You can always find them through the Oral History Association's web portal, and that's a good starting point. There may also be situations where you feel abused or exploited by your client, like if they have been consistently late on payments, for example. If they're taking advantage of you in other ways. There are ways of leaving gracefully if you find that you do have to go. And this may mean offering to refer them to another contractor. But of course, if you've had a horrible experience with this person, you really wouldn't want to refer them to somebody in your network who you respect and who you want to think well of you. But if it's just something where you're unable to continue, offering to find someone else or even to subcontract out to somebody else if you're unable to close your contract completely. And then, of course, returning anything in progress that you were unable to complete so that they're able to pick it up again with someone else. And this is also why it's helpful to have a termination clause in your contract in case you do need to leave a project behind after the work has already begun. Your first year in freelancing is probably the most important. And that's because this is the time when you're doing a lot of experimenting and where you will, through your learning experiences, generate the information that you need to understand the cost of your work, the scope of work in the long run. So the first thing I would advise for when you're just getting started is to keep careful track of everything. Track how many hours you spend because it helps create accurate cost estimates in the future. Keep careful track of your expenses for things like materials, professional development, rent for your workspace or a portion of your rent if you work from home, travel, things like that. And this also helps you to calculate the larger cost of doing business. Another thing I highly recommend is just to stay busy as much as possible. Always be working on something. If it's possible to work full time, that's excellent. It's not always possible. And do this even if your hours aren't billable, as we discussed before, because you need to grow your portfolio, you need to get more learning experiences, and you need to expand your skill set. But remember to only work for free if it would help you gain those specific skills or to build things that would be really helpful for your portfolio. Work on building your network as you get started. You need to meet people and learn from them, but also support them. Oral history is a field that is still very much growing, very much on the rise. Clients need to be educated about what oral history is. Potential clients need to be educated about what oral history is. And people that you hope will be able to refer you work in the future are much more likely to do that if you're able to refer work to them too. Similarly, if they need a subcontractor, they may want to call you and vice versa. So remember that these aren't just people that you're hoping to get work from, but these are people that you are hoping to support. And then just as often as you can, pitch projects. So this involves researching potential clients, figuring out how your services fill a potential need that they have, and then try to make a direct connection of some point. Have a conversation with somebody there, get some feedback on the idea, and then write a proposal, send it in, and follow up. You may have to do this many, many times before something actually gets picked up. So remember that pitching projects, writing grants, anything like that is a lot of uncompensated labor. And so that's part of what you're hoping to compensate down the line as you start to generate revenue for your business. And then this is also a time when you will really need to be careful about managing your funds. You may not have a lot of revenue or savings to dip into. Remember that what you charge your clients is not your paycheck. This is revenue for your business, and you have to be able to cover everything involved in sustaining your business out of those funds. And then paying yourself will just be a line item out of that amount. So I'm going to pause a little bit here if there's any questions that came up as we go, and then I'll cover a few last few bullet points. One question that did come up from Sarah is just whether I can provide some example cost ranges or an hourly rate that either personally I have charged in the past or that I'm aware of for others. That's a really good question. And I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer for it, unfortunately. I've worked in several different states and contexts, and it's hard to say if my living wage would be appropriate as a milestone. I think the best resource for something like this is always going to be one-on-one conversations with somebody who can get a sense for the kind of work that you do, the kind of clients that you're going after, and can sort of advise you based on that individual information. There's another question about insurance. And again, I have no experience with buying insurance, but if others in the chat do, feel free to chime in. Another person, Karen, has asked if corporate or personal clients are more interested in projects. That's also an excellent question. I don't have a sense myself. When I first got started, I was mostly subcontracting for people who had private clients, individuals doing personal history projects. And then I eventually took on some private clients of my own. It wasn't work that I specifically enjoyed, so I tried to transition more into working in nonprofit and academic settings. The way you market yourself for those are completely different. So it really depends on what you want to do. Who you have in your network really helps. What I would recommend is finding people who have the kind of work product and experience that you would like to do and just asking them how they got started, how they built their portfolio. For me personally, when I wanted to work for nonprofits and academic institutions, one thing that I found really helpful was getting to understand them, getting to know their needs and their interests, and offering to do things like, you know, if there's a project that I thought would be really interesting to them, offering to work on the grant. Now, of course, that's unpaid labor, but if the grant goes through, then of course I've been written into it and I can work for them under those circumstances. Corporate clients I've done very little of, so I wouldn't be able to speak to that directly. I actually never did advertise for personal projects. When I first got started, there was an organization called the Association of Personal Historians. I think they have since closed, but they had something very helpful, which was a practitioner directory. I know practitioner directories are something that have been raised within the OHA, and I don't know if they'll be able to have one in the near future. But essentially what that offers you is Googleability. That means that if somebody, you know, decides they want to do an oral history project for their family, and they type that in as a search term, association like the Oral History Association is much more likely to come up than an individual in their services. And so through a practitioner directory, you could find services that way. So maybe look for other organizations that may have a practitioner directory and become a member. And then again, referrals are the best way to go. So if you have a local professional organization where people train each other, or where they network, or where they have conferences, a good way to get started is just by getting to know those individuals, letting them know what your portfolio is like, and subcontracting for them. So a lot of times people who work for private clients won't just create the archival material of an oral history, they'll create an actual work product like a book, or something multimedia that involves photos or video or audio or something like that. And so there's a lot involved beyond just the project management and the oral history. There's design, there's photo restoration, there's transcription, there's editing. And so if these are services that you want to provide in your own business, you can try to find ways of marketing them to other practitioners who would have you on as a subcontractor. That builds your network and your client base that way. So one of the things that I wanted to cover just very, very briefly, this has already come up a little bit, is that I really have no information to offer on insurance and LLCs. Another big part of freelancing is managing your money and taxes. And we could do a whole other workshop just on those things. But an important piece of managing your money is understanding tax rates for freelancers in your area, and making sure that you set aside enough funds for that, and understanding that as a freelancer, you're technically a very small business. And so you may need things like an employer identification number if you're going to be subcontracting people to do transcript processing, editing, any number of those things. You need to understand if you owe tax withholding on their work. And again, this is something I would recommend you get professional advice on, not just personal advice. Some advice that I got really early on in my own career that was super, super helpful was to have a separate bank account for my business, so that the revenue was going into a place that was separate from my own personal checking account, that I could set aside what I needed for paying taxes, and that I could come up with a regular amount that I was paying myself out of that, and set aside the rest that I needed for business expenses. And that really helped me clearly delineate what was for me and for my own life, what was for my business, and what really needed to be set aside for tax purposes. And again, you may end up having to pay taxes 4 times a year as opposed to once a year, because again, you're a small business. And there's many, many different ways to handle that. You may actually become a business, or you may just check a box that says you're a sole proprietor. Again, I recommend getting professional advice on all of these things if the terms I'm throwing out are unfamiliar to you, but they are essential to freelancing, and something worth understanding in the long run. I'm just taking another look back through for questions if anything has come up. I'm glad to see that people are putting resources they trust in the chat. If any of this is useful to you guys, I highly recommend that you take a moment to write these down so you can look them up in your free time later. All right, well, if there are no other questions, we have about 10 minutes to go before 2 o'clock. I will stay on the line if other questions come up, or if there's anything you want to talk to me personally about through the chat. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending today, and that is all I have to share. I just noticed that someone put in the chat that it's possible to look up the contact information of other OHA members, and that's actually a great resource. As you look around, you may be able to Google other members of the OHA, see what they do, what they produce, and reach out to them directly to ask for advice on your work and on getting started, especially for questions like how much you think it would be appropriate to charge, how to structure your first year, how to approach clients, things like that, and get the specific kind of advice that you need. That's probably the most important piece of advice.
Hey Liz, what kind of work are you doing now for Columbia, and how did your independent work set you up to get that job?
Wow, that's an excellent question. I would say probably just the diverse portfolio I was able to build over the years. Again, I migrated away from private clients just because that was less interesting to me, and more towards project management situations where I would be working with an organization to do a large amount of interviews to create archival material. And I think why that led to my work at Columbia was just because of the diversity of my experience at that point. I could say that I knew 3 or 4 different ways to solve a problem, that there wasn't just one practice to lead to what we needed. So the work I'm doing with Columbia now is I'm the project manager for the Obama Presidency Oral History Project. And that is a 4 or 5 year initiative to gather about 800 interviews with people who either work directly for the administration, who put pressure on it from the outside, or people who have perspective on American life during those years and how it was affected by public policies.
As a follow-up question to that, how did you document that experience? You mentioned a portfolio. What was the easiest way for you to create, to show them that body of work?
That's another excellent question. I found it essential to have a website so that I could be found, so that people could connect me to the work that I was doing. Part of what I had as part of that website was not just, a bio and testimonials and that sort of things, but I had a detailed list of clients who are willing to be publicly known. So of course, private clients, you can't list the name of the family that you've been working with most of the time. But if you subcontract for somebody who runs a small business, or if you work directly for a nonprofit or an organization, you can always list that. And then I would just have little pieces of work products or links to multimedia archives that I'd been involved in creating, things like that. And then the other thing that was helpful was a blog at first, where I could, share my expertise or my commentary on certain things. And then later I migrated that to sort of a news place where if any project I had worked on had gotten coverage, I could put that there. So it was kind of a one-stop shop for all things me. So that if anybody did find their way to my work, or if they did find their way to me, they could clearly link out to the other projects I'd been involved in. Personally, I didn't actually have much use for social media. I didn't use it at all. So if anyone else has had experience marketing themselves or showing their work through social media, feel free to share that. But personally, it's not something I ever used or benefited from.
So it's Chris again. One more question. How has this, how did the work that you did as an independent contractor, how is it as a matter of content and process and the relationship building on the Obama project, how did that set you up, not just professionally, but intellectually and philosophically too?
Kind of a big question. I'm not entirely sure how to answer it. So what specifically about the projects I took on prepared me for the work I'm doing now?
Yeah, how did it set you up to be so successful in terms of what you've drawn from your narrators? Perhaps, I'm wondering if they're spilling state secrets and, or Mitch McConnell is sitting there not just lying to you. But all this work has developed you into a mature oral historian on top of being a really good professional person who can manage this large project. And so there's a practical set of questions you already answered for us, but there's also some philosophical ones there, right?
About what's unique about my practice as an oral historian?
Well, it could be partly that. Yeah, that's part of the answer. I mean, because we're each going into oral history as an individual. And so you as an individual will have successes with these oral histories in the Obama project. So like what sets you up to be successful?
Wow. Well, it's certainly telling that we all want to be professionals and freelancers, but we want to do it in oral history, which is notoriously an underpaying gig. So obviously the craft must have its own rewards. And certainly one of the reasons I keep going back to it is how much I appreciate learning from people and accessing lived experiences and accessing communities that I never otherwise would have encountered. I love being invited to places I never would have gone. I love being invited into people's homes and getting to know them. And every conversation is an opportunity for me to change and grow. I found that even in situations where I'm not interviewing people, where I'm just processing other people's interviews, I can listen to them, and those memories become part of my life experience as well. So that's certainly something that I would say that every project I've taken on has had me grow as a person as well as a professional. I'm afraid I'm not understanding your questions, but I hope my answers are
great. No, it's great because it's a continuum, right? That who you are evolves into who you will become. And sorry, I'm just in a philosophical mood this afternoon.
Absolutely, it's a philosophical time. We are all in our homes becoming philosophers.
Yes. I'm wondering if any of the participants have any other questions for Liz.
Oh, what types of deliverables do I see most often? I mean, anything you can imagine is something that you can do with oral history, frankly. I have seen bound books. I have seen oral histories used as part of more documentary works. I have also seen public art installations and community memory projects that result in gatherings and presentations that inform contributions to a shared public space. I mean, really, the sky's the limit. Todd, I guess I would put that question back on you. Is there anything in particular that you feel especially qualified to make, or any type of client base you would particularly hope to access? And I don't need to put you on the spot. Yeah, books and raw transcripts, absolutely. Raw transcripts tend to be very useful because they're searchable. They're easy to organize. There's no replacement for the human voice, of course, which is just wonderful if you're able to use an actual recording. And paper lasts the longest. I mean, even digital archives will eventually deteriorate. They're difficult to maintain for their own reasons, but paper pretty much just sits there as long as you can keep it dry. So if you want to create an heirloom document for somebody, then yeah, a book is pretty much a solid way to go. Oh, yes, I do have a favorite book printer. I'll have to remember the name. I feel like it's Yes, Edition One Printing. I think they're based out of California. I love working with them because they can really do anything, and they do short run prints. So if your family really only wants 1 or 2 copies, you know, you don't have to sell them on like a bulk shipment. You can just give them that. All right, well, it's 2 o'clock. I guess I will hand it back to our organizers to bring things to a close and to let you know where you can access the recording later if needed.
Well, Liz, thank you so much once again. And even there's plenty here to sink our teeth into. If you want to rewatch the webinar, it will be put up behind the paywall, and you all are members, so you can access that under the webinar link and go back through and see what kinds of information Liz has provided you and use it. And again, thank you for joining us today. And thanks to Faith Bagley for her technology support. Have a great week, folks. Again, thank you. Bye.